So today I'm going to be talking about simulation in economics and biology using a particular model which I'm researching and I'm developing with a researcher at King's, and it's called the lazy stopping model, or LSM for short. So I'm going to be talking about how the model works, the ideas behind it, and what it can be used for. And one of the main applications will be to simulate different strategies of organising things like software projects or any sort of project really, which has a lot of uncertainty in terms of the project itself, in terms of what needs to be done and when and so on. And the idea is that using this sort of software to simulate new projects like software projects, you'd be able to determine what kind of strategy would be the best strategy for a particular situation. And during the talk I'll be talking about this type of simulation, and this overall general kind of type of simulation is called agent-based modelling. And so you'll hear the word agent a lot, and if I talk about agents, I could be referring to people which are simulated in the simulation as agents, or we could be talking about animals, if in biology it could be animals, or it could even be cells, like biological cells, and they could all be referred to in the same type of simulation as agents, and hence you get this agent-based simulation as a kind of a topic. So that's what we're gonna cover. So I think the first thing I need to do is talk a little bit about why it's called the lazy stopping model. So the first reason is that it relates to a branch of decision theory called optimal stopping theory. And that theory is to do with questions of how long you should continue to gather information before you can make a choice based on that information and know that that's probably your best choice or nearabouts your best choice. So a classic example is called the secretary problem, and it's just an example of if you have to interview several candidates for a job, how long should you carry on interviewing and seeing more candidates before you stop and know that you've probably got about the best candidate? So you can actually try and figure this out mathematically, and that's quite interesting. So the second reason it's called the lazy stopping model is obviously the word lazy is in there. And so this is because the agents in the model are not doing what, if you like, they're supposed to. So what they do, so you can think of them as being lazy. If they don't do enough work that they should be doing, then we can think of them as lazy. But in fact, that's just one adjective to describe a whole host of reasons why the agents in the simulation might be doing not the work that they might themselves want to do. Maybe they're busy doing other things they think are important, or maybe they're unreliable for some reason, or maybe there are things that they just don't know that they have to do because there are like hazards ahead, like a trap or something, which they can't see. So all those things generically means that there's a wide variety that we can think of them as ignorant about what they need to do. The last one, which is to do with hazards being in front of them that they can't see, that's a really important one for this type of simulation. So the third reason it's called lazy is because the simulation itself is lazy, which means it doesn't simulate or use information that it doesn't need. So the idea is that the simulation only has the information it needs. And that's different to a lot of other simulations that take this general approach of agent-based simulations. So for the rest of the talk, I'm going to discuss how it works, how the model works and what it simulates. Then we're going to discuss a little bit about uncertainty, because that's a key topic in the model, how it models that. And then finally I'm going to talk about some of those applications that it has in the real world. So first, let's talk about this idea of traps. So what do I mean, when I talk about traps? I don't know if some of you are familiar with Donald Rumsfeld. He has a famous quote from a few years ago when the US were waging apparent war on terrorism against Al-Qaeda, as they were then known. And he said that there are knowns, and there are known unknowns, and then there are also unknown unknowns. So he implied strongly that the CIA don't know how to model the unknown unknowns, so they don't really know what they're doing. And they didn't really have an answer to that. So this model is mostly about how do you model unknown unknowns. So things that the agents don't even know that they don't know. And the way to think about it, so this is obviously quite tricky, and people have talked about this for a long time. And the way that the metaphor I'd like to use is the idea of a trap and falling into traps. Because you don't see, the whole point of a trap is you don't see it until you're almost in it. So as an example to illustrate this, I've got some photos here of a place in Stoke called so there's on the right-hand side, it's a club that's kind of in the middle of nowhere called the Underground. And a colleague of mine, a few years ago, he lived in Stoke and he went to this club and he had a few drinks. And when he left the club sometime that later that evening, he wanted to get back to a taxi rank. And he normally just goes across some wasteland to get there because this club is in the middle of nowhere. But what he didn't know, incidentally, he was like looking at his phone while he was doing this because like he's a bit younger than me. Everyone just looks at their phone now when they're walking along. So he was doing this, and then he fell into a hole, and it was a big hole because now you can see, if you see on the top right, there's some wasteland where the Underground is, but on the bottom right there's a new Tesco, and this is what he fell into, was the foundations of the Tesco. So he wasn't expecting that, obviously. I mean, he didn't, yeah. Well, he didn't break anything, which is lucky. And he just found himself lying there, and he realized that he was okay. And then in the end, he just managed to climb out of this hole. I think it was about 12 foot high. And he went home. So that was all right for him. But this captures the idea of unknown unknowns, and the idea that you can simulate this. So how would you simulate this? So the way you would simulate it is you would have an agent that represents Phil, and then you would initialize that agent with some information about how he's going to behave. Now maybe this agent, Phil, has had a few drinks. Maybe he hasn't. Maybe he hasn't had a few drinks. He's going to behave slightly differently. He's going to pay more or less attention to what's going on. And maybe this agent Phil looks at his phone all the time, regardless of what he's doing. Or maybe a different agent Phil actually looks around. And then we also have in the simulation some traps, like this hole. And then we want to see if this agent Phil is going to fall into this trap. That's all we want to simulate. So we just need the information to understand that. So that's the basic idea of what this simulation simulates and how it treats unknown unknowns. So if we think about this in the more general case, right, the holes that you fall into are normally not physical holes. If you're at work, you're falling into different kinds of traps. And they're traps to do with making a bad decision because you didn't have the information that you thought you had, right? So if you're an economist, you might call this general case a utility trap. It just means that you make a bad decision, like Phil did, and then there's a cost to getting out of that hole that you found yourself in. And it's more of a metaphorical or abstract hole, but it's something that costs you something, right? So I'll give you an example of this sort of a hole, slightly more abstract. My fiancée fell into a utility trap. What she did was she met a friend of hers for a drink, for a coffee in the local neighbourhood. And they immediately agreed that the cafe that they had agreed to meet in and that they were sitting in was not a very nice cafe. So they thought, let's go to a better cafe. And they had a short conversation and agreed to go to the French cafe, which was round the corner. So they set off, and my fiancée is telling her friend that they're going the wrong way. And her friend is insistent that they're going the right way, and so they eventually end up at the French cafe. Except that my fiancée was referring to a different cafe called Boulangerie Jade, which is a French cafe, but not a cafe called the French Cafe, which is around the corner. So as you can see, she's fallen into a utility trap. There's no physical danger to her health, but it's cost her something potentially. Maybe she doesn't like the coffee in the French cafe. So it's cost us something. And we can model this the same way as the physical trap in the simulation. We just have two agents, they have a conversation, and they spend a certain amount of effort in deciding where to go, right? They describe the options to each other, and then when one of them goes, yeah, I know what you mean, then they set off. And we can model the agents having different kinds of conversations, and we can see if A, they choose the cafe which has a trap behind it, because maybe they chose a different cafe and there's no trap there, because it's described uniquely by both of them. So as you can see, you get a flavour of what you can simulate with this idea, right? So now the other idea, as I mentioned, the reason it's called a lazy stopping model is because the simulation is lazy too. And so what I mean by that is that we just model the relationship between the agent and the traps. We don't have to worry too much exactly what the agent is doing. So if you're modeling the fill agent, you don't care exactly what he's looking at on the phone. You just want to know, is he likely to be doing a task that means he doesn't pay much attention to what's going on? And so a lot of other agent-based models, they would have they would model the actual procedure of everything that's happening. I'm not proposing to do that. So I have less information in my model than they have, but I know why my information is in the model. So that's all I need to say about that. It's a slightly different, it's more economical model. Right. Yeah, sure, please.
We understand that the agent hasn't foreseen the particular trap.
Yeah.
But you, the modeler, have to be able to foresee that kind of trap.
Yes. Yes. So the simulation is like an obstacle course. So every time we run it, we generate some traps, and then we initialize the agents, and then we see whether the agent does enough in its strategy to discover the trap in time, or maybe just misses the trap entirely because it doesn't go that way. So if you have a lot of traps, it's more likely to fall into a trap. And if the agent has a strategy, like, for example, if the agent brought a torch with it, and when it went home from the club, it used a torch, then even though it doesn't know in the beginning there's a trap there, it's going to discover there's a trap, more likely, right?
In thinking about the Queen's question in 2008, or to the economists, why did none of you see this coming?
Yeah.
For you to have been there and modelled it and seen it coming, you
Yeah.
would have had to be, listening to a wider group of commentators or something?
Yeah, so that's a big topic. I mean, people who predict crashes are right 9 times out of 2. And that's a bit of a problem, right? So it's not so easy to just listen to everybody and expect you'll find out what to do. But I don't know if that helps with your question. Maybe we can move on and come back to it. Yeah, okay. So now we've discussed how the model works and what kind of thing it's simulating. It's to do with these unknown unknowns. The next thing we're going to do is just discuss a couple of different ways of thinking about uncertainty that the model is related to, just to kind of give you a couple of different ways of thinking about it, because it's been very literal so far. So one way you can think about what the model is doing is that it's as a fractal kind of model of the terrain ahead of the agent. And so fractals, for those of you who may be not familiar with where it came from, were just sort of invented or discovered by Benoit Mandelbrot. And he was a statistician who at the time was just trying to get some numbers for how long the coastlines were of different countries. I'm not sure why he was needing to do this. But when he looked at different maps, he got different numbers for how long the coastline was. So he looked at a map of England. One map said it was so long, another map said it was a different length entirely. And he realized, of course, the reason for this was that the maps were at different scales. And so if you measure a coastline with a ruler of a certain length, you'll get a different length than a shorter ruler, for example, or a longer ruler. So I've given an example here. Hopefully you can see my slightly cartoony sketch. I've got the coastline in white, which is the actual coastline, and then you've got a ruler trying to measure the length of that coastline, but the ruler is at the minimum kind of distance that it can measure, because that's the scale of the map. and you get two different lengths because the blue ruler is shorter than the sort of brown ruler there. So this is where he came across this idea of fractals, and I think that the lazy stopping model is fractal as well, but whereas this is, if you like, a kind of a horizontal fractality, because you get a more windy road in reality than when you first look at it, right? With the lazy stopping model, the tasks are fractal more in a kind of vertical way, in the sense there are holes you can't see ahead of you, and so you fall into the hole, and then you have to get out of the hole. And another metaphor is like a can of worms. Like you start doing something and you accidentally open a can of worms, and then you have to put all the worms back in the can before you can carry on. So do you see, the task has got a lot longer than when you first looked at it. And this is very predictable. In the same way that fractals are very predictable, it's very predictable that when you first estimate a task, it appears to be shorter, and then when you go to the actual resolution of the task, it always turns out to be longer. And this is the kind of phenomenon that we're kind of capturing.
Crossroad.
Hmm?
Crossroad.
Yes, or any project really. But yes, the bigger the come, the harder they fall, right? So then there's another way to think about this, which is very useful if you're actually writing the code for this lazy stopping model. The way that I will actually think about it when I'm coding it is to do with this idea of task elasticity. And so it's another way of thinking about that sort of fractality. And it's slightly different because it relates to the idea that it's to do with how elastic is the result of the task depending on the inputs that you put into it. So for example, if Phil was walking across a rugby field on his way home from the club, and it's perfectly flat rugby field, it doesn't matter how much or how little attention he pays to where he's going, he's never going to fall into any hole. There are no holes, right? So regardless of the input that he puts in to his task, the output is the same. He just ends up exactly where he wanted to be in good time. If it's an assault course or this foundations, then of course it's way more uncertain what the result will be, depending on small changes in how much effort he puts into the task. And this is what enables you to model this sort of stuff, is thinking in terms of this elasticity of the task. Because it can be elastic in different ways, in the same way that a market can be elastic, supply can be elastic in relation to demand, which is a concept we're familiar with, which helps us to characterize the terrain, if you like. So that's what I want to say about that. Oh, and also that we can also think of the assets that you have to get out of these holes. So, for example, if you built a robot that was going to walk across the terrain, maybe the robot you build is great as long as it's flat, but if it falls over, it can't get up again. So then obviously any holes it falls into, they're really expensive because someone has to pick the robot up and rescue it. But if you had a robot that can automatically right itself no matter how it falls over, then effectively the holes that it falls into don't matter so much. So from a utility point of view, it doesn't use much utility. So hopefully that's pretty clear. So that's kind of the detail of how to think about uncertainty and these unknown unknowns. So now, I've already discussed how it works and what kind of thing it simulates. I've talked about how to think about uncertainty. So now I'm just going to mention a few applications. So the first application that I want to talk about is that you can simulate a creative process. And you can't simulate everything that happens, but you can simulate some important features of it. And an example would be film editing. So film editing, if you're creating a new film, is a creative process. And it doesn't matter how much experience you have, the fractality of the terrain is high. There are lots of unknown unknowns because you've never made this film before, right? Every time you make a film, it's unique. And it's like a project in that sense. And there's a risk that a film editor told me about. So this is a guy named Julian Doyle who edited Time Bandits. And he told me that with digital film editing, there's a risk of what he called snow blindness. And he called it snow blindness because what can happen is, because you can edit very quickly, you can make lots and lots of choices, one after another, and think that you're making the film better and better. But because there are these unknown unknowns, what's happening is that you're not making decisions with actually enough information. You're making decisions with too little information. And then 2 or 3 hours into the process, you suddenly realize you've made some really bad mistakes and the film's getting worse. But by that point, you may not be able to get back to where it actually was, because you've made all these changes and there are only so many undos and you've run out. And so he called that thing of getting into that hole and not knowing how to get out of it snow blindness. This is the kind of thing that this model can simulate. So you can have a different strategy to editing a film. So like an alternative strategy would be not to go mad on the film editing suite until you're very clear about what the path is ahead and what you're trying to achieve. So maybe you discuss it with somebody, you draw some things on the wall, you go and have lunch, you think about it a bit more. And even when you think that you've got it, you don't go actually start editing. You leave it, you give yourself some space of a couple of hours. And at that point, you come back and you start editing. That strategy might yield a much better result. And in fact, this is what people do now, because digital editing suites are much quicker than old-fashioned editing where you're actually cutting the film. But that slow process prevented you from getting snow blindness. So you see that it's quite counterintuitive that if you do what you want, you don't get what you want. And it's to do with these unknown unknowns. Right, so I hope I'm not going too quick, but I probably should be pausing a bit more. But yeah, so now I want to talk about how to simulate different strategies for filmmaking. For software development. And there's this idea in projects, software development projects, called the kind of agile method or an agile strategy. And there are loads of different versions of this. And so one of the things that this model can do is help you to choose between these different strategies and find out which ones are likely to work and which ones are unlikely to work in a different context. So some examples of some agile strategies. There's a book called The Startup Way by Eric Ries, and there's another book by a guy about what they call the lean method of user experience design and stuff. And this is an example of a strategy where the idea is to get customer feedback as soon as possible. And the sooner you get customer feedback, the better for your project. And if you don't get customer feedback in time, then your project is going to not discover and learn what's really useful. And so another strategy is called working right to left. And this is a strategy to do with changing the conversations in the project. And instead of making them about the deadlines that you have to make or the process that you're following and the documentation, they just focus, all the conversations are focused on what is the outcome that we're after. And that's a big change for lots of organizations that follow, say, Prince2 or some other methods, or even if they follow a so-called agile method, maybe they don't really talk about the outcomes. And so one way is to change the conversations to improve the result. Finally, there's, this is not an exhaustive list, it's just some examples. There's this idea of continuous delivery. And this is the idea that you have a technology that can deliver updates to your software almost continuously, like every day or every week at least. And that way, if something's wrong, when you learn about it, you just roll back that one release. And this is in contrast to where you work and work and work, and then every quarter or half a year, you try to release 20 different products or features, new features. And if one of them is wrong, you have to roll back everything. And the idea is that you'll be more successful as long as you release things incrementally very, very quickly and then learn from that feedback. And it's to do with modularity as well. So that the idea that one feature doesn't affect another feature. So if something's broken, it doesn't break everything. So these are some examples of some different strategies that management people aim to improve projects. Finally, there's the idea of waterfall, which is this very old idea from the 1970s of how to work, which is very process-oriented and is not considered agile. It's not fashionable, but it's still used. And so you have to understand maybe why it's still being used. Okay, so I'm now going to talk about some of the advantages of simulating these different strategies. Now, one advantage is that you can describe exactly what the strategy is claiming to be because you describe it in code. So instead of talking vaguely about it as a management kind of coach would do, you have to turn it into a precise hypothesis of a strategy. So an example would be with the startup way. The idea is that if you get customer feedback as soon as possible, you will learn what you need to learn to have a successful project. So that's a hypothesis that the trap is triggered by getting customer feedback of almost any quality. So an example in the book of the startup way is somebody making a cardboard interface. So making an interface out of cardboard and going to a shopping mall and showing it to potential customers in the shopping mall and getting feedback before they built anything at all except this cardboard interface. So the strategy is a hypothesis that the traps that you need to discover will be found reliably this way. And so the simulation can precisely state what that means and implies. So another aspect of the simulation is that you can be more complete in the effects of any strategy. So I talked about how pausing before editing could have very beneficial consequences. But in lots of strategies to do with agile, they talk about avoiding having to pause at all costs because they're familiar with delays within an organization. So if there is a blocker, it must be removed as quickly as possible so the developer can carry on developing. But we know, probably from doing a careful analysis, that a lot of the time, if you're blocked from doing something, you might realize you were going to make a big mistake and you have the information now and you've avoided getting into a hole. So these kinds of subtleties of the double-edged effect of almost every strategy you pick up in the simulation. And it gives you a more accurate idea of what's going to happen. Finally, there's also this idea of statistics as a way of getting information. And in a simulation, this is the idea that you run the simulation over and over again, like a climate model, and then on average you get a certain result. And that is more precise about what's likely to happen given uncertainty than kind of almost any other method, I think. Finally, I keep saying finally, but it's not. But there is also the advantage of the fact that you can model a specific context. So one of the kind of agile coaches that I was hearing, he said that you can slavishly copy Spotify's software development method, but unless you're a Swedish music streaming company, it probably won't work. So yeah, this is the problem, is that you can't really just copy any method because the organizational context will be different in every case. So Microsoft and Google and Amazon, they all probably work in an agile way very effectively, but they don't use the word agile internally, even though it's a buzzword for lots of other companies, because they have their own specific method of doing things that works for them. With a simulation, the whole point is that you can simulate something that you don't have any evidence for previously, because the context is part of the simulation, and it could be a unique context. And then last but not least, the value of a simulation can be as a training tool. So even if it doesn't predict exactly what's going to happen, even if it's not reached that level of sophistication, as a tool to explain what could happen and what people should understand about what they're doing, it could be very valuable. So these are all the reasons, all the advantages of an application of this sort of model. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about the ideas from nature that influence this model. And I first kind of had this idea about modeling traps after reading a paper by a guy named Donald Hoffman, who has a TED talk here called "Do We See Reality as It Is?" And he gave an example of this beetle in Australia. And in this part of Australia where this brown beetle lives, I think it's Dongara, I'm not sure if that's the right pronunciation, this beetle is attracted to brown females, beetles, and tries to mate with them. But in that area, the Australians are liable to obviously drink a bottle of beer while they're driving and then throw it out the car window when they've finished with it. And the brown bottle is very similar to the brown of the beetle. And even though the bottle is a completely different size to an actual female beetle, this male beetle will mistake it for a female and then attempt to copulate with the beer bottle to an unlimited, until it dies pretty much. And this was actually a problem that they had to address and had to have a kind of a campaign to stop people throwing their bottles out the window of cars, because this beetle was going to probably go extinct in this area of Australia. And the point that he's trying to make is that we're very presumptuous about what we think in terms of our ability to perceive the world around us realistically. And to me, this is a trap that the beetle has fallen into. And the trap is an unknown unknown, that in evolutionary terms, it never existed as a problem. So this is kind of the inspiration for this talk. Yeah?
Well, a similar example in David Attenborough's last
There are lots.
about albatrosses.
I saw it, yeah.
Yeah, these, you wouldn't believe it, but the parents, there's these loving parents looking after the babies, flying miles to find food for them. But as soon as the baby falls out of the nest, it doesn't recognise it.
Yeah, it can be right next to it.
Right next to it.
Be right
It's
next to it.
extraordinary.
Yeah, it's not sort of programmed to recognise its own young unless it's sitting on the nest exactly where it's supposed to be. If it falls out because of the wind, it's to do with climate change, isn't it? Because
that was the
there's the effects, right? Because it gets now so windy there that they fall out of their nests and then they're going to die. So this is the idea of kind of novelty, unknown unknowns as traps. So that's where the idea came from. Now, this kind of research that I'm doing has applications in microbiology as well. And I won't go into too many details about this because it is quite technical, but there's actually problems of understanding cooperation in bacteria. And the problems are to do with mutants that might cheat the cooperating community and consume the cooperative benefit without providing their own, through their own efforts, providing anything to the communal kind of good. And this is a real question in microbiology, is why don't these mutants destroy cooperation in bacteria? And one of the ways of modelling why this doesn't happen is to do with how cooperation is encoded in the first place. And so the idea would be that cooperative genes have to be encoded to have other properties that give them the ability to prevent mutants from taking advantage of them. And if you want to discuss this with me, I'm happy to talk about it afterwards or in the questions, but I think it might be a bit too technical to go into in detail right now. And this is something that I'm working on with a guy at Imperial, and it uses the same sort of concepts of traps and having assets to deal with unknown unknowns, but it's applied at a genetic level. Okay, so we've kind of reached the end of the talk so far, and I'm doing okay for time, which is good. So I've discussed how the model works and what kind of thing it simulates, and also the focus on uncertainty and how to understand uncertainty, and also discussed some applications. I think that what the research is about, if you want to understand the practical benefits, I think the key benefit in the first place will be for a business to be able to simulate different strategies that they're offered as a way to deal with uncertainty, and be able to understand and make a considered, informed decision about the best strategy with far more precision and completeness than has ever been available before. So instead of a cacophony of different voices saying you should try this strategy or this is the fashionable thing, this method of simulation would be able to put real power in the hands of decision makers and give them more confidence in knowing that the projects that they're managing might actually even finish on time or deliver something worthwhile. And that's not something that we can really say at the moment. So that's the kind of aim, and the effort is directed towards that.
Are you trying to make everything?
No, because it's about messiness, but it's about insurance, if you like, against unknown unknowns. It's about working in a way where you go beyond what you can see right now and actually being able to quantify how well prepared you are for those things that are unseen, that are in the future. They're out there, but you can't see them right now.
They must be seen, as I see it, and be seen as a trap by somebody for them to be in the model.
Yeah. No. You have to have anticipated, the potential for the trap, right? But so you have to use an expert who's familiar with. But you can collect examples, if you like, from far and wide, and then you can use those to code the model. And so even though you can't say in this specific case we know that trap is out there, we can do a kind of, if that trap is out there, then this is what will happen with your strategy. And if the trap isn't out there, that's a different matter. But it's how to just because you have to anticipate it, it doesn't mean it's not useful. It's definitely useful.
So if you're running a business, I run businesses, so I can see where you're coming from.
Mm.
How on earth do you think it is possible to know every possible event that could take place, that could make any decision that I make, or prepare me for any decision I make? I mean, it seems an infinite number of things.
Well, it wouldn't be perfect, would it? I'm not claiming it would be perfect. I'm claiming that it would be something that hasn't been done or really tried before, but is perfectly possible to give a pragmatic, reasonable approach as to, the traps that other people have encountered, that we've collected over time,
Okay, so
and then
it's bringing together, it seems,
Yeah.
a collective understanding of, if you like, business,
Pitfalls,
how business
yeah.
works, and so on,
yeah,
into a model
yeah,
which,
with more precision and completeness than you would otherwise be able to get.
so you have a bigger range of,
Yeah, yeah. It would be like having an expert who's seen it all before, but in code, and then applied to the very specific context that you're talking about. And then, even if you argue with the model, you're arguing with something that you can see and touch and actually is kind of concrete, rather than someone saying I'm not sure about this and not being able to say why. There's a big difference there.
so in other words, can I give you a concrete example? That,
Yeah.
I'd like to expand my business, and I have a son who has all kinds of ideas about doing that. And I can see some of the pitfalls. But what you're saying, the advantage of having this model in place was that I could draw upon the examples of a very wide range of
Yeah.
people and being in that situation.
Yeah. As if like a library of knowledge, right? And then also there would be no intrinsic bias. So instead of listening to one voice saying you really want to watch out for this, because that itself can be a trap, if you see what I mean. So in the code you capture the benefits and disbenefits, if you like, of every strategy, much more precisely than you would if you just said we want to avoid this at all costs.
So isn't there a danger perhaps that I would not do anything? Because
No, you can often take some. I think that there are lots of strategies out there that we haven't even really discussed, because we're not discussing the strategies that are available with any precision or rigor. So there are lots of ways of giving yourself some insurance against specific kinds of trap, right? And that insurance costs something, right? It costs you some effort, but it could be very valuable. But the insurance is more physical you know, in terms of the way that you behave or the technology you use or so on. You know, and that's what we're trying to discover, is what are the strategies out there that we're not even really defining or understanding, because nature knows about these strategies, and that's what this topic is about, really. Is about what strategies are out there that nature already understands to deal with unknown unknowns, because these are far simpler systems, these bacteria, really. You know, they don't have a complex brain or anything like that, so they fall victim otherwise to traps of their own making, because they're blind in many respects, like that beetle, but they're still able to be pretty robust. And so
it's not clear whether you know that the traps are there or you don't know the traps.
you don't know, but if you think that there may be a trap, right, you can't see it initially, but you can change your strategy. So, like, you know, Phil could bring a torch with him every time he goes out, and that's a form of insurance. If he uses the torch, he can see any traps that appear. He didn't know there was going to be a trap there, but he can take a torch. And it's a similar sort of idea, but there's more subtle versions of that, the kind of assets you can have, which help you.
Example, then?
Can I, yeah?
This is from the 2001 Quadrennial Defence Review, which is where the President asks the head of his army to predict what's going to happen in the next 10 years. If you've been a security policy maker in the world's greatest power in 1900, you would have been a Brit looking warily at your age-old enemy, France. By 1910, you'd be allied with France, and your enemy would be Germany. By 1920, World War I would have been fought and won, and you'd been engaged in a naval arms race with your erstwhile allies, the US and Japan. By 1930, naval arms limitation treaties were in effect, the Great Depression was underway, and the Defence Planning Standard said no war for 10 years. 9 years later, World War II had begun. By 1950, Britain no longer was the world's greatest power, etc., etc.
Yeah.
This is an example of
Yeah.
unknown.
Yeah.
I don't see that any of these traps could have been known about as traps, because the mindset has already thinks it's eliminated them.
Well, no, but that's what I'm saying, is that you can be more rigorous about. So the traps are certain types. So to do with you don't say specifically which power you're going to be allied with, right? But then you know that it can change, right? So the way you would model that would be to do with the possibility exists, and then
As
you know.
unknown, you don't know that it could change.
No, I mean you should know that it can change. I mean, that's not.
I suppose the related general question is, how narrowly do the traps have to be defined? Because the sense is about this is,
Yeah.
you know there are traps out there, but you
Yeah.
don't really know
Yeah.
what there are. That's your first point.
Yeah.
But from what you've said later, it sounds like when you construct the model, you have to specify
When you can.
carefully what the traps are, which means that they're not unknowns anymore.
No, but what they are is a distribution. So if you imagine the simulation of Phil and the hole, right, with a certain probability, when we run the simulation, a hole appears of a certain size and in a certain place, right? So
But we're talking holes.
it's a hole. Yeah.
Right, so if Phil walks across there and a dead bird drops.
Or it could, yes, or it could be anything. It could be any dimension that you choose to put into your model. But the point is that the model doesn't rely on you specifying exactly where the trap is, or exactly. It only asks you to specify a distribution.
But
That
not
you then-
exactly what the trap is.
No,
You're
when
just
the
saying
model
what
runs,
the
it will
trap
select randomly from your distribution according to a certain risk profile, where you choose the risk profile, and then it puts a trap every time it runs. It's different, you know. So every time the simulation runs on the military alliances, it's different, right? But on the average, how do you do against all these different random things that can happen? That's the question.
So the model's changing the traps.
Every time
Oh,
it
right,
runs.
right.
Yeah.
So you could add in a trap that a UFO was going to descend and land right on top of Phil's head.
If you want to, yeah. It's up to you. It still requires an expert to
Right.
say what traps are possible and what traps are not possible, and decide what the distribution is. Yeah, but that's still a big advance on anything anyone's doing at the moment, I feel.
Can I ask, I don't know if you're familiar with the term generative design?
Vaguely, I'm not sure.
Right.
Yeah.
I just wondered if that was in your view. It's to do with, well, putting in what they call parametric constraints, or it's a similar idea, I think, in a way, because you're putting in things you do know that you want to, measurements that you want to meet.
Yeah.
So it might be that, you know, we want this building to be within we want to build a building, we
Right.
want it to be within a mile of St Paul's Cathedral,
Yeah.
and we want it to have access to this, that, or the other, and you can then run a simulation with the modelling,
Yeah.
with an algorithm that will then come up with a number of different relationships.
It tries to satisfy those constraints.
Yeah.
It's called constraint programming.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, yes. So that's a sort of application. Yeah, you could try that. You could try, if the model got to an advanced stage, you could ask it to satisfy the constraints of this sort of risk, these sort of unknown unknowns. What's the best strategy for me to use? So that would be a great way to use the model if you were confident. You know, oh, it got, you know, and so in later iterations, that's the kind of thing you might try and do. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Can you turn it upside down in the sense of, well, you might sort of stumble into a hole in the dark, but at the bottom of the hole you find a treasure.
Absolutely, absolutely. This is another big feature. So I can show you some examples of positive traps.
Yeah.
So if you're interested in innovation, Henri Cartier-Bresson is the photographer I think about a lot, because he essentially set traps that gave the opportunity to capture information that didn't otherwise exist. So he would compose a picture, and he would use his ability to make a very careful composition of the static elements, and then he hoped, I'm not sure if he orchestrated it, but he hoped, I suppose, that someone would run across and you'd get this fast-moving action, and you would get the combination of a careful composition and a sort of sports photograph in one photograph. And this was very original, and it's a positive trap. So he's trapping this, in this case, the information, and again, you can be robust to opportunities, not just negative opportunities, if you like. So these can be positive traps, and that's a big area of interest for me as well. Yeah, yeah. Because innovation is something that we're oblivious to most of the time as well, because we don't understand the unknown of an opportunity. Yeah.
If you go back to Crossrail, seems an example of a current project which presumably has a project manager and presumably had a timeline, and then it overruns, and we sort of, whereas as well, I sort of knew that was going to happen.
Yeah.
That's what always happens.
It's fractal,
Which
isn't it?
implies that there's something rather naive
Yes.
in the planning process that just
The
ignores
naivety
things.
is.
Everybody, the common sense thinks,
The
well, something is going to happen.
That's what I mean. It's quite easy to predict. That's what I'm saying. The information you need isn't huge. We can all predict it. What you do about it is obviously more difficult. But being able to formalize that prediction. So people have an intuition, which is bad things will happen, right? It's quite easy. This formalizes that intuition and then makes it something that you can negotiate with. Whereas at the moment, unknown unknowns are considered off the table because they're unknown unknowns. That's a big mistake. It's just to do with our modelling ability to talk about it in a precise way is what's missing.
The projects nowadays are always set up with risk assessments, where you try and find out, you try and guess what the unknown unknowns are.
Yes.
Well, you try and guess what the known unknowns are.
Yes, or you state a 1 in 1,000 year event, and you say, this is what happens, this is our performance against this 1 in 1,000 year event, or 1 in 500 year event, like flooding, for example. This isn't, in my view, this isn't very good. I think you need to do what I'm doing rather than what they're doing with that sort of estimation.
So how is what you're doing different? That's what I'm asking.
Because first of all, because the dimensions that are involved are to do with the resources that the agent puts into the problem and how those resources do against the event. So they model risk as if it's just about making a choice, but they don't understand that technology and infrastructure and all these things, like if you're designing a car, you design it with crash, the ability to crumple zones and And if you're designing a racetrack, you put tyres in certain places. And that's the level that the simulation goes to, is what effort are you making specifically to cover that specific scenario? And what they're using for their risk models, to me, there's not enough information in the model.
So you're a much more detailed version.
It's more detailed because it's the two important inputs are what is the agent doing to mitigate that risk, moment to moment, if you like, and then how are we modelling that risk over trials of simulations. So their distributions are very basic distributions. This is a 1 in 1,000 year event, this is a 1 in 500 year event. You could have a hole in the ground that is there every time, and the agent misses it every time because it's not where the agent is going. So the distribution has to be complex enough to be completely discontinuous, not like a linear regression or anything like that. Not even non-linear. It's not even non-linear. The moment that you have a terrain that you're modelling in the simulation and an agent that is going somewhere, you can have a completely discontinuous sort of event, where 1,000,000 times it misses that hole, and then there's one time that and you can be quite confident of capturing that accurately. When they talk about 1 in 1,000 year events, they just base it on past data. They're not simulating it, they just look at past data, which is, for climate change, that makes no sense, for example. For flooding, it makes no sense. You can't just use past data to estimate a risk. That's where simulation comes into its own.
So how does it deal with black swans?
This is all about black swans. That's the point. The black swan is just a trap. You have to be able to imagine the trap. So the first point is, can you imagine it? There are some people who have no imagination, but you just hire someone who has some imagination. When the military were struggling against the terrorism of Al-Qaeda, there was a story that they went to LA to talk to scriptwriters. Because they wanted, it's a true story apparently. They talked to scriptwriters because they wanted to know what's the worst thing you can imagine happening. Because they didn't have imagination themselves. But the point is you need a bit of imagination as well. But yeah.
I'm going to ask you about nature. You said that nature knows this.
I'm saying that nature deals with risk very robustly, using structures, right? Using it's in the structure of nature, the way that it interacts with itself as a system is something that it can cope with unknown unknowns very well, generally. There's limits as well, of course, but of course there are. And then we discussed the limits with the beetle and the albatross. There are obviously limits, but also you've got to realise that nature has had an unbroken run of success of over 3.5 billion years. Now, if you don't think there's something to learn from risk, from looking at nature, I think that you're missing something here.
Isn't that generally by huge redundancy?
Yeah, no, redundancy is important, absolutely. And that's what I talk about with this model is about redundancy. So you can code genes with redundancy, and we know that's important. But with this sort of approach, you can say what the redundancy is capable of doing specifically, not just redundancy of a very crude, inefficient kind, but a way more efficient sort of redundancy. And that's where the limits of our understanding are at the moment, is how do you use redundancy efficiently? Because anyone can think of yes, you just have 1 million offspring and one of them has to survive, and that's all. That's a simple redundancy. It's very inefficient. There's way more efficient kinds that are possible.
One of the challenges, just going back to Crossrail, for instance, if we knew now, what we know now, if we knew back then, I suspect that never would have started.
Yes.
What the trouble with many companies in our somewhat constrained economic situation is that if they really knew the cost and the pain of undertaking a venture, it wouldn't.
Well, economists say that about every entrepreneur. According to economists, entrepreneurs are completely irrational. You just look at the stats, they shouldn't be doing that.
Innovation happens.
People
reinvent their organisations or whatever and get over all the disasters.
Yeah.
And come out with...
But there are opportunities to be had, as we were just talking about. So it's not just about, the negatives. There are positives with unknown unknowns.
If you overload the sense of all of those unknown unknowns, and we perhaps too much modelling, maybe it would constrain getting to the starting line, is the question.
Yes, I don't know. I'd love to get to that point where it's so popular, starts affecting rates of entrepreneurship in the country. That would be amazing.
If I may comment, is that in a way imposing a human response to what is not a human process? Because in a way, it's what I felt that I was listening to, correct me if I'm wrong, is that by showing lots and lots and lots of different possible strategies, then some positive evaluation becomes available. So it's not simply looking at lots and lots and lots of risk, it's looking at lots of risk plus strategies. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right.
So that
You can go in.
changes the human response.
Yes, I think my comment was more about our constrained economic circumstance, whereby companies don't have the resilience that nature does, do not have that sort of capacity to, at least feel they do not have the capacity to weather the unknown events that come up.
Yeah.
I think it's more
I think there's a more human level psychology to that as well, which is interesting, which is that individually, if you kind of appear to be taking lots of risks, for example, if you're a software project manager and you want to get working as quickly as possible and get things in front of the customers and show them stuff and so on, you can be very eager to do that without being oblivious to all the mistakes that can happen along the way. But this model can show that can be more risk averse. To act quickly can be more risk averse than staying where you are. So these everything has two sides to it, which the model is able to pick up. So people's intuitions are generally not going to be wrong, if you see what I mean, but they might not even understand why their strategy is successful or why it works. And that's what the model hopes to be able to elucidate, right?
Picking up on Richard's point reminds me of the strategy that when there used to be this remarkable company called ICI back in, I suppose it's a while ago now, but the way ICI used to operate in their research was they'd hire the best brains by paying over the odds. They put them in this research institute in Runcorn, and they quietly say, look, get on with it, chaps, because they knew that there was a high probability that out of these unknown, something worthwhile that was commercially viable.
Yeah.
But as Richard said, the requirement for efficiency in the modern economy meant that strategy was regarded as no longer being viable. You just couldn't afford to give them the freedom for the
But of course, there's such a naivety about what is efficient, right?
Well, that's what the story shows up, an incredible, restrictive and, to use another of your words, unimaginative.
So it's a lot of this is people already have the intuition that is good. It's giving them the ammunition, if you like, to have those conversations at a level and point to some sort of evidence. And of course, that's what's been missing, I think.
Wasn't this used to a certain extent intellectually during the war in trying to break the code of the Nazis' code?
Yeah, so I followed that work that was declassified a little while ago, and there is a simple model of kind of information with a threshold, so that optimal stopping theory that was an interesting example that Turing used to in part of the process of decoding German signals and deciding what to work on. And there's a certain, if enough information goes into this simple kind of decision-making algorithm, then they action that code. And it was kind of a little race between the positive and the negative information. And I thought it's very interesting. It's called the Bambarismus process, and you can find out about it online. And it's an example of this kind of optimal stopping theory. So yeah, it's related to, the ideas are inspired by stuff like that, yeah.